This is a story by Hugh Barney O'Brien called The Coping Stone. And I assume that you know what coping means, but coping is also the centre stone above an archway. To cope. So here's the story. Joe waited until Kerrigan clanged up the sale on the cash register, neatly piled the change beside the glass, and after his customary wipe of the counter, left him and headed for whatever he had to do in the public bar. Kerrigan knew his job well. He just set up the stage and brought on the props. The real moment came when Kerrigan left and he was alone. He loved savouring the thought of the first mouthful. Then he could settle down and look back on a day which had not been a good one. He hadn't slept well last night. His daily routine had been disrupted even before the day had begun. In fact, it hadn't been a good week. Ever since Sheila's appointment had come, he had felt unsettled. They hadn't talked about it. It was only a checkup. It was that interfering bitch Clerkin that had blown it out of all proportions. Half the bloody town knew about it within hours, and of course she had to go with Sheila today. The bloody ghoul. Your pint all right, master? That was another part of the ritual between them. Kerrigan always stuck his head back into the lounge, but never waited for the answer, which was always the same anyway. He felt slightly annoyed with Kerrigan, taken for granted. The pint tasted a bit off, and God knows Kerrigan had pulled enough pints for him to know. There was a loud burst of laughter from the public bar. He didn't like that sort of thing. For him, a drink was a quiet, sober affair. He could still feel the heaviness of his lunch sandwiches on his stomach, just as it had been throughout the afternoon classes. Mulhern had joined him for the lunch break, and that hadn't helped. The new boss rattling with the staff. Jesus. Not that he envied him the job of headmaster. He hadn't wanted it anyway. If he had only appointed someone else, he would have been happy. Yet he felt small in the eyes of the people of the town. And Sheila, though she never mentioned it, was, disappointed. He lifted the pipe again to his lips, but didn't relish the idea of drinking it. It was cold and comfortless and would surely churn up the undigested sandwiches. But how could he get round Kerrigan? He didn't want to answer a litany of questions about his health or to make Kerrigan feel that his pint was bad and he couldn't go elsewhere. No, he couldn't do that. This was where he had his after-work pint before returning to the comfort and safety of his own home and to the meal carefully prepared for him by Sheila. But today it would be a cold meat plate. The brown-white head of the pint looked very much part of a bad day. Well, Joe, thought I'd find you here. It was Mulhern. Joe felt vulnerable. He hated to be caught unawares. And what the hell did he mean by, thought I'd find you here? Joe was glad to see Kerrigan appear from the public bar. What can I get you, Mr. Mulhern? Asked Kerrigan, the fingers of one hand tapping the countertop, his body half turned towards the shelves of bottles behind him. A couple of Crestons, if you please, Mr. K. Not for me, Joe protested weakly. But Kerrigan was already pouring, and Mulhern toasted Joe and Sheila's good health. Mulhern refused a return drink and said that he had to see a man about a dog. But Joe knew that while the dog in question wore a collar, it was a white Roman one, and it was round the fat cannon's neck. A right gossipy chinwag they'd have, and no doubt his own name would come up. Well, let them. He did his job, and that was all was required of him. The whiskey warmed him, and when Mulhern was gone, he ordered another one for himself. How's the garden going, master? Kerrigan asked as he lifted Mulhern's empty glass from the counter. Grand, grand, Joe replied. It's hard to be at a good garden. Aye, if you have time to watch it, said Kerrigan, and he rushing back to the public bar where the evening crowd was beginning to gather. He liked his garden and spent a great deal of time in it, he and Sheila. There was no need for talk while they worked, and there was order and routine. He liked that. It didn't do to break the mould, because then one had to make a new mould and get used to new things. After his mother died, Sheila had come along in the same mould, and life had gone on as it was before. That was how it should be. Order and routine, stability, like his roses. One of the few tiffs he'd had with Sheila was about the roses. About this very point. His mother had never allowed the roses to be picked. If anyone dared to pick one, she became angry. She said that roses were growing and dying things, and she didn't believe that the latter process should be helped in any way. Sheila had laughed at the idea. That had annoyed him. He had insisted on keeping things the way they were, except for the pruning. The roses were never mentioned again. They were only spoken about in silence. They grew, blossomed, and died. Natural order of things. He tapped the counter with his glass to get Kerrigan's attention and ordered another drink. He'd go after this one. The evening was wearing on, and he already had more than he was used to having. But there was a reluctance in him to move. He couldn't remember going home to an empty house. Kerrigan's was comfortable. At home he would be alone, eat alone. He didn't want that, not this evening. Still, there was no great hurry. He'd decide later. He had trouble getting the key into the front door of his house, and in his fumbling, reminded himself to oil the lock the next day. The house had a cold feel about it. He took off his coat, as he did every evening, but avoided looking at himself in the hall stand mirror, and made his way to the kitchen. The cold plate of ham salad with a protected cover of cellophane stared up at him from the table. The whole white egg with the hardened yolk shadowed beneath glistened with the moisture that clung to its cover. There was a note from Sheila beside it. Don't forget to feed Lucy. From the corner of his eye, he could see the arched shape of Lucy rubbing herself against the glass of the door leading out into the garden. He lifted the blue and white tea towel off the milk jug and moved towards the door, calling unnecessarily, "Here, Pussy, here." Lucy was already licking the milk from her saucer before he had finished pouring. He crouched down beside her, and with his free hand he gently stroked the fur on her back. He began to feel a power inside him that he could neither understand nor control. His hand moved up the animal's back, his grip tightening all the time. Lucy wriggled to get free, and in his efforts to hold on to her, he lost his balance and fell awkwardly forward, while Lucy sprang to the safety of the rose bushes which lined the wall. He turned over on his back and looked up. The roses looked different. The long thorned stems were more prominent than the roses themselves. Sharp, pointed things, hidden traps to ensnare and punish. The petals, visible or half hidden, spreading out or beginning to spread over the green protective casing, teasing and taunting. He wondered would his mother mind if he picked one from this angle. He wanted to laugh, but couldn't. His stomach, throat and mouth felt like a small flued chimney packed tight with screaming birds. Somehow he managed to scramble to his feet, and as he moved towards the largest of the rose bushes, His mother's stern face glared out at him from the crowd. Standing there, Mulhern was hanging like a snot from the cannon's bulbous nose, with a large black head mushrooming out from its centre. Kerrigan had a face like what he imagined Pontius Pilate to have, and Mrs. Durkin was pushing Sheila towards the bushes. Sheila's hands were reaching out, ready to pluck. He tried to call out to her, but each time he opened his mouth, a screaming bird flew out. He fell on the bush, his hands tearing the roses, crushing and tearing at the padded petals. At last he felt the power of his own scream piercing the silence around it, and as the sharp, piercing thorns dug into his flesh, he slumped over the bush, his scream dying in a distorted cadence. Lucy returned to her saucer of milk.